Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. So we're looking at Gott, nicht, mit, diese, Zeit, which translates to, sorry I don't have my translation in front of me, let me get that. Yes, if God were not with us at this time. This is an interesting chorale. I mean, most of the chords are conventional, but some of the chord progressions themselves are pretty wonky. I'll point them out when we get to them, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. No key signature. We start on A minor. We end on A major, and I think this is one of the cases where our opening key is not the same as the overall tonality of the chorale. I'd say the overall tonality of the chorale is A minor, but this first phrase is undeniably C major. We start off with a 6th chord, though, rather than a tonic triad. We then have E, E, G, and C. That's C major over E, which is 1/6. Passing tone in the tenor, passing tone in the melody before we get F, A, F, C, F, and A. That's F major in root position. That's a 4 chord. Passing tones in the outer voices before we get A, C, E, and C. That's A minor in root position, which is a 6 chord. Kind of interesting. I think you could also make the argument that this is a 4/6 chord as well, or I guess rather we would just change the figured bass in this situation. So let me just go ahead and erase all of that. I think there's an argument to be made that there are a lot of these cases throughout the chorale where we have rootless triads here, A, C, E, and C, or I guess it would be 6, 5, or even furthermore 7, 6, 5. Sorry it took me so long to get to that point, just because of the fact that typically speaking a 4 chord would make more sense here, based on Bach's previous usage of patterns like this. But I mean, this very well could be a 6 chord. The overall tonality of the chorale is A minor. Bach could be foreshadowing what is to come next. And 6 and 4 in this context are more or less entirely substitutable for one another. What is the word? Yeah, I guess substitutable. There's another word that I'm thinking of too, but it's not coming to mind. Anywho, we have some passing tones in the inner voices, actually in all the voices here. We have B, B, D, and D. Very interesting. This would be a 7 chord. Typically when we have a chord progression where we have 6 going to 1, typically this is a 4/6 chord, but sometimes we get 6, and then we connect to a tonic triad, or the tonic of the scale is in the bass here. We always have the leading tone connecting the 2 chords, but here we have an entirely full voiced chord, and here we have 6 going to 7 going to 1. But interestingly here we have a doubled leading tone, which is not characteristic of harmony of this time period. Typically Bach goes out of the way to not double the leading tone, but to maybe to justify that, the tenor and the bass are actually singing the exact same note, so it's like they're singing a unison, so it's not as if we were hearing it in 2 distinct voices. But it is interesting that we have the leading tone doubled. But afterwards we do get C major, C, A, C, and E, so I think you could make the argument that this is a 6/6 chord, but I think it's more likely that this A is an accented non-chord tone. This is actually C major, C, G, C, and E. But lots of strange chord progressions in this chorale. This could just be one of many. We then have F, A, D, and D. That's D minor in first inversion, 2/6. We know that Bach loves 2/6 chords in cadential situations. Passing tone in the alto. And then we have G, B, F, and D. That's G7 in root position. That's a 5/7 chord. And then we cadence on C major, making this a perfect authentic cadence. C, C, E, and C. 3 roots, 1/3. Looking ahead, we have another perfect authentic cadence, but this time it's in the key of A minor, and Bach is going to introduce a modulation scheme that we're going to see later in the chorale as well. It's an interesting one. So we start things off with some secondary dominants. I don't think we've moved to the key of G major, like, you know, even if it were brief, like this were like a 4/5 or 4/7/1 progression in the key of G major. It just sounds like this is a we have no reason to believe that we've modulated to the key of G major just for 2 beats in this context. We have A, C, F sharp, and C, which is F sharp diminished over A. That's 7/6 of 5. Like I said, F sharp is the leading tone to G, so this is a secondary dominant. And then we get G major, G, D, G, and B. And here's the interesting bit. We immediately get melodic minor in the key of A minor here. So I think it's possible to say that we have a progression that's tonicizing A minor and we modulate afterwards, but I think in this context we just have a strange case where we're modulating over the subtonic seventh. We've seen it in the past, but it's relatively uncommon because the subtonic seventh isn't usually favored over the leading tone seventh. We just don't see it used as much. And I'm honestly just chalking it up to the fact that this chorale has a bunch of interesting harmonic quirks about it, conventional chords, but contextualized in unusual ways. So here we have 7 actually going to a 4 chord, D, D, F sharp, and A. That's some transitive harmony. We haven't really seen transitive harmony in a couple of videos. But this is harmonization of the melodic minor scale, so we know at this point chances are we're in the key of A minor. We then have G sharp and B as passing tones in the upper voices, leaving us with D, D, G sharp, and B. That's a 7 chord in second inversion, but because it's a passing chord, the inversion doesn't really matter too much, but I'll include it anyways because the lower voices are chord tones. So 4 going to 7, probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. And then we get A minor, A, E, A, and C. So 4, 7, 1, that's a normative progression. Passing 7th in the bass, F, A, and D. That's D minor in first inversion, or 4, 6. Passing tone in the bass, and then this interesting, well, I guess Bach is using natural minor on the way down. It's typically how you see the melodic minor contextualized. Raised scale degrees going up, natural scale degrees going down. Not always, but I'd say the majority of the time. That's something that the textbook is definitely spot on about. And this cadential pattern is something that's going to come up later as well. We have D, A, F, and B. It's B minor 7 flat 5 over D. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, but 4 going to 2 is kind of interesting. Thirds progressions are always interesting because the fact that the chords are mostly similar, so it's a relatively stable progression. Typically chord progressions, or I say Bach tends to choose chords that are either adjacent to one another or a fourth apart, right? Here we have a thirds progression to start things off. I feel like that's an anomaly, but we have 1 going to 4, that's a fourth apart. 4 going to 6, that's another anomaly. This is not the best chorale to choose this, but we have adjacent, 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 a fourth away, secondary dominant, but still adjacent chords. A fourth away, you get the picture. So when we have thirds bass progressions, especially in as high a density as this particular chorale, it's something to, I don't know, maybe be sensitive about or be sensitive towards. I don't think it's really commenting too much, but it is interesting. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B. That's our 5 chord, E major, with a passing 7th in the alto. And then we have A minor, A, C, and A. Another 3 root, 1/3 spelling, just like our first cadence. Looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of A minor, and similar to how the previous phrase worked, I think we're going to do so through the key of C major again. It's just there's a lot of similarities between the second phrase, or the blending of the beginning of the second phrase to the rest of the phrase with the beginning of the B section. So I think we start things off in the key of C. I even have this A minor chord analyzed as a 6 chord because it's a common chord and makes sense as a predominant alighting with the beginning of the next phrase. We have B, G, G, and D. That's G major in first inversion, or 5, 6. And then we go to C major, C, C, G, and E, which is our tonic triad and root position. Passing tone in the bass, E, G, G, and E. Very similar to what's going on here. I think I guess technically, yes, this is a 3 chord, but I think there's an argument to be made that we have another rootless, a rootless triad here, but we're using 1 rather than 4. So the fact that that's occurring twice in the chorale, I think, sort of strengthens the argument, because we would expect a 1/6 chord here that's separated by this passing tone. It's a very common thing for Bach to do. But we then have some passing tones in the lower voices as well. That gives us D, A, G, and E. Not really an analyzable chord using Bach's typical vocabulary. And then we get another thirds progression too, and ascending thirds progressions are particularly interesting. Usually they're descending Like 6 going to 1 is pretty interesting, but typically we see 1 going to 6. Yeah, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but we end up having another thirds progression after this. G, B, D, and B, which is just a 5 chord, like 1, 3, 5, 3, sort of acting as a predominant here. But the same way that 5 is our pivot point back to the key of A minor, I think it's also the same thing happening here too, because what's going on in the alto in the second phrase is also what's going on in the bass. So I think if you are analyzing the modulation before we see the melodic minor, this is, I think, where it happens. Of course, you could make the argument that this E minor here is a minor dominant, but I don't know. This, if of the two options, the one that I marked, I feel seems more likely. But like I said, they'd both be accurate analyses. It just depends on how you hear it. But now that we're in the key of A minor, we have pretty much the same progression going on. We have F sharp, A, D, and D. That's 4, 6. This time because the gesture's happening in the bass, so the F sharp is our lowest note, which changes the spelling, but same general idea. And here we have G sharp, B, E, and D on the offbeat this time, so here we don't have 4 going to 7, 6, 4, we have 4 going to 5, 6, 5, which are, I mean, they're functionally identical, but they're just different chords. They're both dominant functioning chords, so it makes sense to see them used in this subdivided context, but there's definitely a strong connection between the beginning of the B section and the end of the A section, which was unveiled through the harmony. Cool stuff. And then Bach continues the idea even further by reiterating the idea back into the alto here with more adjacent harmony. We have 4 going to 5 going to A, C, F sharp, and C, which is F sharp diminished, and that's not a secondary dominant, that is a 6 chord. That's a byproduct of raising the 6th scale degree. 6 is typically a major chord. If you raise the root up by a half step, you have a diminished triad as a result. And then we have B, D, and G sharp here, which is basically implying a 7 chord, but the suspended, or I guess sustained C in the melody here keeps us from getting a completely intact triad. We know that a 7 chord is happening, but it's not going to make it onto the page, unfortunately, as an entirely intact and analyzable chord. But when we have, again, very similar to what happened here, where we have 6 going to 1, when we have the 6 going to 1 in the bass here, typically it's a 4-6 chord. When we connect the two, there's always like the leading tone connecting the two. However, that would be in terms of C major. I realize we're in the key of A minor, so that doesn't make too much sense in this exact context, but it looks like Bach is justifying it with the same thing. I tried to say Bach and justifying, and I said jock. That was weird. But yeah, it seems like Bach is treating this situation the exact same, even though we are going from a 6-6 chord to a most likely a 1-6 chord, which ends up changing the bass, but it's the same general principle. If this was 6 in root position, going to a 1 chord in root position, it'd be the same idea, a connecting tone in between the two pitches. Not necessarily the leading tone in the case of minor, but still a connecting tone between the 6 and the 1. Or in this case, the 1 and the 3. We then have C, E, A, and C like I forecasted. That's 1-6. And then we have a passing tone in the bass before our final cadential chord, E, E, G sharp, carried over from the beginning of the measure, and B, which is E major. Okay, looking ahead, we have kind of an interesting phrase, a mid-phrase modulation as well. We're going to go to the key of G major briefly, kind of similarly to what Bach does here, but he spends more time emphasizing G major here, devoting more time to focusing on F sharp, which is just less of a tonicization and more of a modulation here. But we end with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, so we go to G and then we go to C. So our 5 chord does resolve A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, root position. I think this is where we go to G as well. It becomes our 2 chord, passing 7th in the bass, F sharp, D, A, and D, D major in first inversion, that's our 5 chord. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, D, D, F sharp, and A. It's a 5-3 chord. Or, sorry, not a 5-3 chord, a 5-5-3 chord, just 5 in root position. We'll just change the figured bass to separate it from its preceding chord, which is in root position, or sorry, first inversion, passing tone in the melody, and then we get E, G, E, and C. That's C major in first inversion, which is 4/6, so a bit of a deceptive progression here. And then we have some passing tones in the lower voices, F sharp, carried from the beginning of the measure, A, E, and C. It's F sharp minor 7 flat 5, again 4 going to 6, probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. And then we get G major, G, B, D, and B, tonic triad, root position, which also with F natural in very close proximity, I do believe this is where we are moving to the key of C major, and this is now our 5 chord. We have a passing tone in the alto as well. We then have A, C, F, and A. That's a 4/6 chord. Again, Bach with these sort of cyclical progressions that don't end up resolving, but we get a turnaround and then we get a resolution. So 5 very easily could have gone to 1, but here we have 5 going to 4/6, and that's going to turn into a cadence, which then takes us to 1. Hey everyone, Forrest from the future here. If you watched the original upload of this video, you'll know that the analysis cut off right here at this 4/6 chord. I don't know why the video only uploaded about 75%, but here I am to complete the analysis. Granted, it has been a while since I've looked at this chorale, so I am judging my analysis based off of my notes here. We are currently in the key of C major, and we were just talking about a cyclical chord progression that does not resolve to 1, but rather takes up this idea of there being a deceptive progression going on after the 5 chord that seems to be some theme, some type of harmonic idea that continues throughout the chorale. We then have some lower neighbor tones, or we have some neighbor tones in the lower voices here before we go back to another 4/6 chord again, so we don't need to reanalyze. However, as we know with 4/6 chords that connect to the 1 of the scale, or it's not even necessarily 4/6 chords, it's when we have this bass motion of 6/7/1. The 7 is always there, especially when it's being connected in the bass. So with these passing tones here, sometimes we have an entirely voiced chord. In this case we have B, D, F, and A, which is a B minor 7 flat 5 chord happening here off the offbeat, which would be a 7/7 chord in the key of C major, and then we cadence on 1 in an imperfect authentic cadence. Interesting for the imperfect authentic cadence to have the 5th of the chord in the melody. Typically it has the 3rd, but there's nothing in the textbook that suggests that the 5 being in the melody makes it any less valid. It's just based on what I see in Bach's writing, it's much more common for the 3rd of the chord to be in the melody. The 5th of the chord is something that's much more common in half cadences. But we're looking for a point in which we move back to the key of A minor for our final cadence. We do have a perfect authentic cadence here in the key of A minor, but we stay in the key of C major, I believe, for a little bit, where we harken back to an idea that we saw here at the end of the, or I guess leading into the second phrase here, where we start off with some secondary dominants. We started with F sharp, E flat, A, and C. This very interesting E flat here, this descending chromatic line in the tenor. This spells F sharp diminished 7th, which is 7/7 of 5, because F sharp is the leading tone to G, and G is our dominant. And then that resolves where we expect G, D, G, B, which is our 5 chord. Then in another sort of roundabout fashion where we don't see 5 resolve to our tonic, we have F, D, A, and A, which is D minor over F. That's a 2/6 chord. Typically we see these chords flipped, but granted, this is going to be the case where Bach is modulating to the key of A minor. This is now 4/6. And another sort of interesting thing that's happening here where Bach juxtaposes the idea of 2 and 7 at the same time, but in kind of an interesting way. This doesn't really have too much of an impact on moving into the next key, right? The difference of A versus B here, and the melody is the difference between this being a 7/7 chord in the key of C and the difference between it being a 2/6 chord in the key of C. So some food for thought. Sometimes Bach tonicizes the 2 chord, which then turns into the 7 chord of the next key. He plays with 7 and 2 chords via this whole step here, but I think what keeps it from really, I guess, occupying that space, being that 7-2 chord ambiguous device that he uses sometimes, is the fact that the A is held in this alto here, which creates this dissonance here, this whole step between the soprano and the alto. But moving along, we get an interesting chord here. We have E natural this time, because we had E flat in the previous measure, G sharp, and C. Now, I think, depending on how you look at this chord, we would expect an E major chord after this, like a 5 following 4-6, right? With this sort of Phrygian half cadence motion in the bass, the flat 6 going down to the 5. But with the C in the melody, it creates another one of these unusually resolving progressions, and instead of getting 4-6, we actually get an augmented triad in first inversion. This is C augmented, which is really unusual. We actually get pretty much the entire E major triad as well, but C stays relevant for both eighth notes, which makes me feel really like Bach is just playing with this idea of deceiving through harmonic expectations, right? He's subverting our expectations, where we would expect a predominant to go to a dominant to go to a tonic. He is flipping the script and like spindling off into a series of turnarounds, which is really interesting. But afterwards, this B is a chordal 7th, but a non-chord tone in this context. Sorry, this C is a chord tone. We then get F, A, and D again. We know this chord from the previous beat. This is D minor in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, and the melody as well, which gives us E, A, G natural, and C, which is kind of like a passing tonic 7 chord, interestingly enough. But I think this A is really sort of just functioning like this really long suspension that will eventually resolve down to this G sharp here. So I don't really think there's much reading into this chord, despite the fact that there are 3 voices moving and the bass is moving as well. But interesting tonic 7th little presence here. Actually just a coincidence of all the voices moving along with the tonic being in the tenor here. We then have D, A, F, and B natural. That's B minor 7 flat 5 over D, 2-6-5. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. We then have B, which is a chord tone, don't need to mark it. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B. That's our good old 5 chord, E major, passing 7th in the alto, and then our perfect authentic cadence concludes with A, E, C sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. As far as this chorale is concerned, the fact that Bach, or at least in my analysis, I have Bach modulating back to the key of A minor over 2 series of 5 chords turning into subtonic 7th chords is pretty interesting. I could have even analyzed it here as that modulation occurring, but in this case it didn't quite feel that way. Even though the chords are very similar in terms of the way that he's reintroducing the key of A minor, it's very possible that that's exactly what's happening here. But this D minor chord, it feels a little bit more pertinent to the key of A minor after the G major, I guess, because it's shared with the key of C major. If you look at the other cases where Bach pretty much immediately moves to the key of A minor after the G major chord, we see that he goes via D major chords here, D major, then E major, or E7 over D. This is the first time we see a minor chord, which makes it distinct, even though similar chords are being used here. But regardless, fascinating chorale, very beautiful chorale. I think that wraps up my analysis for today. Apologies for the original upload failing. I did have a fully recorded video, I promise, but here's the re-upload with the rest of the analysis. If you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Feel free to hit the notification icon as well so you can get notified of my daily upload. And also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that my video is going to be seen by more people. That means a larger community, more discussion about analysis, and we like that sort of thing around here, so helps me out a ton. But with all of that said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.